Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little different. We're talking about Victorian children. And honestly, buckle up because their childhoods were, well, they basically didn't have them. So get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe grab a pillow, and let's settle in for a nice long ramble through one of history's most uptight eras. This is the kind of story that'll have you drifting off while simultaneously being grateful you weren't born in 1850. Picture this. It's Victorian England. The year is, let's say, 1860. You're 5 years old. Sounds cute, right? Wrong, because if you're 5 in Victorian England, you're not playing with toys or learning your ABCs in some gentle, nurturing environment. No. You're either working in a factory, or you're strapped into a tiny corset learning Latin, or you're sweeping chimneys, or you're being paraded around a drawing room like a very small, very serious adult. Childhood, as we know it, didn't really exist, not in the way we think about it now. The Victorians had this wild idea that children were basically just short adults, and I mean that literally. They dressed them like adults, they expected them to behave like adults, they gave them adult responsibilities, and if you were poor, congratulations, you got to work like an adult too, sometimes in conditions that would make modern labor laws weep. Let's start with the upper classes, because honestly, their version of childhood was bizarre in a completely different way. If you were born into a wealthy Victorian family, you might think you'd have it made. Rich parents, big house, plenty of food. But here's the thing, your parents probably didn't want to see you, like at all. Victorian upper-class children were raised by nannies and governesses. Mummy and Daddy were busy doing whatever wealthy Victorians did. Attending balls, drinking tea, judging people. The children were kept in the nursery, which was usually on the top floor of the house, as far away from the adults as architecturally possible. You'd be brought down for maybe an hour a day, so your parents could inspect you, make sure you were still alive and reasonably well behaved, and then back upstairs you went. This whole system was designed to produce perfect little miniature adults. You weren't supposed to be playful or silly or, heaven forbid, childish. You were supposed to sit still, speak when spoken to, and demonstrate that you'd been properly educated in whatever your governess had been drilling into you that week. And the education. Oh boy. If you were a wealthy Victorian child, your education started absurdly early and absurdly intense. We're talking 3, 4 years old, and you're already learning to read. By 5 or 6, you're studying multiple languages. French, obviously. Latin, because of course. Maybe German, maybe Italian, depending on how ambitious your parents were feeling. Little boys were being groomed to eventually go off to boarding school, where they'd be emotionally traumatized in that very special British way that somehow was considered character building. Little girls were being trained to be perfect wives, which meant learning music, drawing, needlework, dancing, how to run a household, how to make polite conversation, and absolutely nothing useful for actual independence. The whole thing was exhausting and joyless, so deeply joyless. Let's talk about one specific example, because it really drives home how weird this all was. Queen Victoria's own children. You'd think being royal would mean a pampered childhood, right? Wrong again. Queen Victoria and Albert were absolutely obsessed with raising their children properly. And by properly, I mean they were borderline tyrannical about it. Their kids had strict schedules. Every minute of every day was accounted for. Lessons started early in the morning and continued throughout the day. The children were constantly being tested, evaluated, and critiqued. Albert especially was intense about this. He created detailed memorandums about how each child should be educated. He believed idleness was basically a sin. The kids barely had any free time. When they did have a spare moment, it was supposed to be spent in improving activities, reading serious books, studying nature, definitely not just playing. And Victoria, despite being their mother, wasn't exactly warm and cuddly. She famously didn't really like babies. She thought they were ugly and annoying. Once her children got a bit older and could hold a conversation, she tolerated them better, but maternal warmth was not her strong suit. The result? A bunch of royal children who grew up way too fast, burdened with expectations, and emotionally kind of messed up. But we'll get back to them. Now let's drift over to the other end of the social spectrum. Because if wealthy Victorian children had it weird, poor Victorian children had it absolutely brutal. If you were born into a working class or poor family in Victorian England, your childhood ended almost before it began. Child labor was everywhere, and I mean everywhere. Factories, mines, farms, workshops, streets. Children as young as 4 or 5 were working, not playing, working. The Industrial Revolution had created this massive demand for cheap labor, and children were the cheapest labor available. They were small, so they could fit into tight spaces in factories and mines. They had tiny fingers, perfect for detailed work in textile mills. They could be paid almost nothing, and they couldn't exactly unionize or fight for their rights. So you'd have children working 12, 14, sometimes 16-hour days in dangerous conditions for pennies. It was grim. Take textile mills, for example. Children worked as scavengers or piecers. Scavengers crawled under the machinery while it was still running to pick up loose cotton. Piecers stood at the spinning machines, tying together broken threads. Both jobs were incredibly dangerous. Kids lost fingers, lost hands, got caught in the machinery. The air was thick with cotton dust, so lung diseases were rampant. Or coal mines. Children worked as trappers, sitting alone in the dark for hours, opening and closing ventilation doors as coal carts passed through. Imagine being 7 years old, sitting in pitch blackness underground, waiting. Other children hauled coal carts, crawling through tunnels too small for adults. The conditions were horrific. And chimney sweeping. Oh, chimney sweeping. This might be one of the most disturbing child labor practices of the Victorian era, which is really saying something. Master sweeps would buy or apprentice young boys, usually around 5 or 6 years old. These small boys were small enough to climb up inside chimneys to clean them. They'd be sent up narrow, dark, twisting flues, scraping off soot and creosote. Often they'd get stuck. Sometimes they'd suffocate. Sometimes they'd fall. Sometimes they'd develop what was called chimney sweep's cancer from constant exposure to soot. The boys were often kept deliberately undernourished so they'd stay small enough to fit up chimneys. They slept in the soot. They were beaten if they refused to climb. Some master sweeps would light a small fire under a reluctant boy to force him up the chimney faster.
It was absolutely horrendous, and it went on for decades before reformers finally managed to get it outlawed. But even without the most extreme examples, just regular working-class childhood was harsh. If you weren't in a factory or a mine, you might be selling things on a street. Matches, flowers, newspapers, whatever you could. Children worked as servants in wealthy households. They worked on farms. They worked in their parents' shops or trades. School? That was a luxury most poor children couldn't afford. Even after Education Acts started making schooling more available, many families needed their children's wages to survive. Learning to read was less important than eating. So, poor Victorian children learned adult responsibilities incredibly young because they had to. They learned how to work, how to survive, how to contribute to the family income. Childhood as a protected, innocent time of play and learning? That was for rich people. But here's where it gets even more complicated, because even the Victorians started to realize that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't great.
The Victorian era was also when the idea of childhood as a special, separate phase of life started to really develop. Reformers, writers, and activists began pushing back against child labor and advocating for children's rights. The Factory Acts gradually restricted child labor. Education became more accessible. But this created this weird split, this tension between the old view of children as small workers or small adults and this new, emerging view of childhood as innocent and precious. You can see this tension everywhere in Victorian culture, in their literature, in their laws, in how different classes treated their children. Charles Dickens, for example, wrote extensively about mistreated children. Oliver Twist, The Artful Dodger, Little Nell, Tiny Tim, David Copperfield. Victorian readers ate these stories up. They wept over fictional suffering children. But real suffering children, the ones working in factories down the street, that was somehow different, easier to ignore. The Victorians were masters of compartmentalization. They'd read heartbreaking stories about poor orphans and feel terribly moved. Then they'd go about their day, benefiting from the cheap goods produced by child labor without making the connection. Or making the connection, but not caring enough to change anything. Clothing is another fascinating example of this whole children as tiny adults thing. Victorian children, especially upper and middle class children, were dressed like miniature versions of their parents. Little boys wore suits. Little girls wore elaborate dresses with layers and layers of fabric. And corsets. Yes, corsets for children. Girls as young as 3 or 4 might be put into soft corsets or stays. By the time they were teenagers, they'd be wearing the full, restrictive adult version. The idea was to train their bodies into the proper shape from a young age, because heaven forbid a woman have a natural waist. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it was actively harmful. Tight lacing restricted breathing and organ development. Growing bodies were literally being squeezed into fashionable shapes. And the clothes weren't practical. Children couldn't run or play easily in these elaborate outfits, but that was kind of the point. The clothing enforced the behavior. If you're wearing a stiff suit or a dress with a bustle, you're not going to be roughhousing. You're going to sit still and be proper. Even babies were dressed in long, elaborate christening gowns and wrapped tightly. Swaddling was still common. The Victorian aesthetic valued restraint and control, even for infants. There were some attempts at reform. The Rational Dress Society advocated for more practical clothing for women and girls. Some progressive parents started dressing their children in simpler outfits, but for the most part, Victorian children were trapped in miniature adult costumes. Then there's the whole issue of mortality. Victorian childhood was dangerous, really dangerous. Infant mortality rates were staggering. Depending on the decade and the social class, somewhere between 15 and 30% of children died before their 5th birthday. In poor areas, in bad years, it could be even higher.
Diseases that we've largely forgotten about now were everywhere. Scarlet fever, diphtheria, whooping cough, measles, tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid. Any of these could sweep through a household and claim multiple children. And medical care was primitive. Germ theory wasn't widely accepted until late in the Victorian era. Doctors didn't wash their hands. Treatments were often useless or actively harmful. Antibiotics didn't exist. So Victorian parents lived with the constant, real possibility that their children might die, and many did. This affected how childhood was experienced and understood. Some historians argue that parents emotionally distanced themselves from young children as a protective mechanism. Don't get too attached until you know they'll survive. That might partly explain the upper-class habit of shipping children off to the nursery with hired caretakers. It also meant that children were very aware of death from a young age. They attended funerals, they wore mourning clothes, they saw siblings die. Death wasn't hidden away. It was a regular part of life.
Victorian mourning culture was elaborate and intense. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Queen Victoria went into mourning for the rest of her life. The whole country joined in, and this wasn't unusual. Mourning had strict rules: what you wore, how long you wore it, what activities were appropriate. Children participated in all of this. So Victorian children grew up surrounded by death, dressed in black, attending memorial services, not exactly carefree. Let's float back to the upper classes for a moment, because their emotional expectations for children were wild. Victorian society valued emotional restraint, stiff upper lip, and all that. Displays of strong emotion were considered vulgar and inappropriate. This applied to children, too. Children were expected to control their emotions. Don't cry, don't laugh too loudly, don't have tantrums, don't show fear, stay calm, stay controlled, always. Can you imagine being 5 years old and being told that expressing normal childhood emotions was shameful? Because that's what happened. Boys especially were taught to suppress emotions. Crying was weak, fear was unmanly, tenderness was embarrassing. This was considered necessary preparation for adult life, especially if you were going to be sent off to boarding school, where any show of emotion would be mocked or punished. Girls had slightly more permission to be gentle and tender, but they also had to control themselves. No angry outbursts, no jealousy, no sulking, perfect little ladies at all times. The result was generations of emotionally repressed British people. Shocked, I know. But seriously, this expectation that children should essentially have adult-level emotional regulation was damaging. Children's brains aren't developed enough for that kind of control. Asking them to suppress natural emotions doesn't make those emotions go away.
It just teaches them that their feelings are shameful. And the parenting methods, oh boy.
Victorian parenting manuals are fascinating in a horrifying kind of way. They're full of advice about breaking a child's will. That was an actual goal. Break their will. Make them obedient. The idea was that children were born sinful and willful. Left to their own devices, they'd become spoiled and unmanageable. So parents needed to dominate them early, establish absolute authority, tolerate no defiance. Methods included isolation, shaming, and yes, physical punishment, spanking, caning, whipping. This was considered normal and necessary. Spare the rod, spoil the child was taken very seriously. Even progressive Victorians who opposed harsh physical punishment still believed children needed strict discipline, firmness, consistency, unquestioning obedience. Praise was used sparingly. Too much praise would make a child conceited. Better to focus on their faults and how they could improve. Affection was also rationed. Too much warmth would make a child weak and dependent, especially for boys. Boys needed to be toughened up.
So you'd have these children, desperate for approval and affection, being raised by parents and caretakers who deliberately withheld both, who believed that strictness and emotional distance were good parenting. No wonder so many Victorian adults ended up emotionally stunted. Let's talk about some specific examples, because individual stories really illustrate how this all played out. Take Bertie, the future King Edward VII, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's eldest son. Poor Bertie. His parents had such high expectations. Albert designed this incredibly rigorous educational program for him. Bertie was supposed to be the perfect prince, brilliant, disciplined, morally upright. The problem? Bertie was a normal kid. He wasn't a genius. He wasn't particularly interested in hours of lessons every day. He wanted to play. He wanted to have fun. But Albert was relentless. More tutors, more lessons, more pressure. Bertie was constantly being tested and constantly falling short. His parents were perpetually disappointed in him. Victoria wrote that Bertie was dull and backward. Albert worried that the boy was lazy and lacking in character. They both compared him unfavorably to his older sister, Vicky, who was genuinely brilliant and loved studying. Bertie's childhood was essentially joyless. Study after study after study. Constant criticism. Very little praise. Almost no freedom. When Bertie was a teenager, he was finally allowed to go to university under strict supervision. And the moment he had even a tiny bit of freedom, he rebelled. He started smoking, drinking, socializing with actresses. His parents were horrified. They'd tried so hard to mold him into perfection, and he'd turned out to be a normal young man who wanted to have fun. Albert actually blamed Bertie's behavior for contributing to his own death. Albert got sick after dealing with one of Bertie's scandals, and he never recovered. He literally died thinking his son had disappointed him one too many times.
And Victoria, she blamed Bertie too. She could barely stand to look at him after Albert died. She associated him with her husband's death. So Bertie grew up with incredible pressure, almost no affection, and then got blamed for his father's death.
His childhood was stolen by impossible expectations. He eventually became king and was actually quite good at it in his own way, but those early years damaged him. He spent his adult life chasing pleasure and approval, trying to fill the void his childhood had created. Or consider the Bronte children, Charlotte, Emily, Anne, and their brother Branwell, plus 2 older sisters who died young. Their mother died when they were very young. Their father was a clergyman, often distant and absorbed in his own work. The children were largely left to raise themselves. They created elaborate imaginary worlds. They wrote tiny books about invented kingdoms. This was their escape.
But their actual childhoods were harsh. They were sent to a school for clergymen's daughters, Cowan Bridge School. The conditions there were awful: freezing cold, inadequate food, brutal discipline. 2 of the Bronte sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, got sick at the school and died. Charlotte later based Lowood School in Jane Eyre on Cowan Bridge. The cruelty, the cold, the hunger, all of it was real. The surviving Bronte children returned home, but their childhoods remained difficult. They were poor. They lived in a bleak parsonage in Yorkshire. As they got older, the girls had to work as governesses, which they hated. Branwell struggled with addiction and depression. None of them had anything resembling a carefree childhood. They grew up too fast because they had to. Their stories, the stories they wrote as adults, are full of orphaned children, mistreated children, children forced into adult situations. Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, the tenant of Wildfell Hall. They were writing what they knew. Let's drift over to another aspect of this: the working royal children beyond just Victoria's kids. Actually, most European royal children in the Victorian era had similarly intense childhoods. Royal childhood meant training for future duty. Every moment was preparation. Take the future Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Victoria's grandson, actually. His childhood was a nightmare. He was born with a damaged arm due to a difficult birth. His left arm was essentially useless, much shorter than his right, and partially paralyzed. His parents, especially his mother, Vicky, Victoria's eldest daughter, were desperate to fix him. They subjected him to endless painful treatments. His arm was stretched, electroshocked, manipulated. None of it worked. He was also forced into uncomfortable apparatuses designed to improve his posture. His head was strapped into a machine for hours each day to keep it straight. His tutors were harsh. His military training was intense. He was mocked by other boys for his disability. Wilhelm grew up angry, insecure, and desperate to prove himself. His childhood trauma directly influenced his later behavior as Kaiser. His aggression, his need to demonstrate strength, his terrible decision-making that contributed to World War I. All of that can be traced back to a childhood where he was never good enough, never whole enough, never allowed to just be a kid with a disability who needed acceptance rather than fixing. Childhood trauma turning into adult catastrophe, tale as old as time. Even childhood that looked privileged from the outside often wasn't.
Wealthy Victorian children had material comfort, sure, but they also had isolation, emotional coldness, and crushing expectations. Middle-class children had slightly more freedom than the upper classes, but they also faced intense pressure to maintain respectability, to demonstrate proper behavior, to not embarrass the family. And working-class children had it hardest of all, with labor and poverty stealing any chance of a real childhood. So why did Victorian children grow up too fast? Because the entire society expected them to. Whether through labor, education, emotional control, or social performance, childhood as a protected time of innocence barely existed. The Victorians were in this weird transition period. Some of the old attitudes, children as small adults, children as economic assets, were still dominant, but new ideas about childhood innocence and the need to protect children were starting to emerge. The result was this contradictory mess where society simultaneously sentimentalized children and exploited them, where childhood was idealized in theory but denied in practice. Things did slowly improve as the Victorian era progressed. Labor laws got stricter, education became more widespread, reformers kept pushing for change. But for most of the 19th century, if you were a Victorian child, you were basically expected to be a miniature adult. Work like an adult, behave like an adult, control your emotions like an adult, all while still being powerless in the ways children are always powerless. No wonder so many of them grew up with issues. We'll keep drifting through more examples, more stories, more weird Victorian attitudes about childhood. But for now, let that settle in. Victorian childhood, not exactly the stuff of happy memories. Let's move along to education in a bit more detail, because the Victorian approach to learning really shows how they viewed children. So, Victorian education. Let's really dig into this, because the way they approached learning tells you everything about how they saw children. For upper and middle class children, education was serious business. And I mean serious in the least fun way possible. This wasn't about fostering curiosity or encouraging creativity. This was about drilling information into young heads and producing properly educated ladies and gentlemen who could take their place in society. Boys and girls were educated completely differently, because of course they were. Their futures were different, so why would they learn the same things? Made perfect sense to the Victorians. Makes us cringe now, but there you go. Let's start with the boys. If you were a wealthy or middle-class Victorian boy, your early education happened at home with a governess or tutor. You'd learn reading, writing, basic arithmetic. Latin usually started around age 7 or 8. Maybe Greek if your parents were feeling particularly ambitious. Then, around age 8 to 12, off to boarding school you went. And boarding school was, well, it was an experience, usually a traumatic one. The famous public schools like Eton, Harrow, Rugby, Winchester. These were institutions designed to turn boys into gentlemen, which apparently required removing them from their families, subjecting them to rigid discipline, and letting older boys bully younger ones as character development. Fagging was a whole system where younger boys served as servants to older boys. You'd clean their rooms, run their errands, basically be at their beck and call. This was supposed to teach hierarchy and obedience. Mostly, it taught resentment and survival skills. The academics were heavily focused on classics, Latin and Greek, ancient history, classical literature. Mathematics and sciences were included, but considered less important than being able to translate Virgil. Rote memorization was the primary teaching method. You memorized enormous passages of text, recited them, got caned if you forgot them. Learning was about discipline and repetition, not understanding or critical thinking. And the conditions, cold dormitories, bad food, harsh punishments, emotional suppression. You didn't cry when you were homesick. You didn't complain. You endured. Stiff upper lip.
The idea was that this created strong, disciplined men ready to run the empire. In reality, it created generations of emotionally damaged men who couldn't express feelings and replicated the same harsh treatment with their own children. But it was tradition, so it continued. Thomas Hughes wrote Tom Brown's School Days in 1857, which romanticized Rugby School and the whole boarding school experience. It was hugely popular. Everyone read it, and it reinforced this idea that brutal boarding school was actually good for boys, toughened them up, made them brave. Never mind the bullying, the loneliness, the complete lack of emotional support. Character building, remember? Some boys thrived in this environment. Most just survived it. Some were genuinely damaged by it. Now girls, Victorian girls' education was a whole different thing. If you were upper class, you were educated at home by a governess. You learned reading and writing, but the focus was on accomplishments. Music, usually piano or harp. Drawing or painting, especially watercolors. A bit of French, maybe some Italian. Needlework, dancing. The goal was to make you an attractive marriage prospect. You needed to be educated enough to be interesting, but not so educated that you'd threaten male intellectual superiority. It was a delicate balance. Too much learning was actually considered dangerous for girls. There were legitimate medical concerns published in journals arguing that excessive studying could damage women's reproductive systems. The brain and the uterus apparently competed for the body's limited energy, and if you thought too hard, your womb would suffer. Yes, really, Victorian medical science was something else. So girls' education was deliberately limited. You learned enough to be cultured and refined, enough to run a household and raise children, but not enough to have careers or independence. Mathematics, beyond basic arithmetic? Unnecessary. Sciences? Not really. Philosophy? Definitely not. Politics? Heaven forbid. Some progressive families did educate their daughters more thoroughly. The Bronte sisters were well educated despite their poverty. George Eliot, whose real name was Marianne Evans, was intellectually brilliant and read extensively, but they were exceptions. Most Victorian girls learned to paint pretty flowers, play simple piano pieces, speak enough French to be impressive at dinner parties, and embroider. Then they waited to get married. Some girls were sent to boarding schools, but these were very different from boys' schools. They focused on the same accomplishments plus deportment and manners, how to walk, sit, curtsy, make conversation, pour tea, all the essential skills for a lady. The curriculum was less rigorous than boys' schools. The discipline was about propriety rather than classical education. You were being polished, not challenged.
Middle-class girls often went to day schools, which were slightly more practical. They might learn some bookkeeping or other skills useful for helping run a shop or business. But still, the focus was on future domestic life. And working-class children? Their education was sporadic at best until later in the Victorian era. Before the Education Acts of the 1870s and 80s, most working-class children didn't go to school at all. They worked. If they got any education, it was at Sunday schools, which taught basic literacy alongside religious instruction, or maybe a charity school if one was available. The Education Acts gradually made schooling compulsory, but enforcement was inconsistent, and many families simply couldn't afford to lose their children's wages, so attendance was spotty. When working-class children did attend school, they were in massive classes, 60, 70, sometimes 80 students with one teacher. Individual attention was impossible.
Teaching methods were even more focused on rote learning than in wealthy schools. Students chanted their lessons, memorized facts, copied from the board. Questions or curiosity weren't encouraged. The goal was basic literacy and numeracy, enough to be useful workers, not enough to get ideas above their station. And discipline was harsh. The cane was used liberally. Stand in the corner, kneel on the floor, public humiliation for wrong answers. School wasn't a happy place for most Victorian children. It was another site of control and discipline. Let's float over to health and childhood illness, because this is where Victorian childhood gets particularly grim. We've already touched on the high mortality rates, but let's really sit with what that meant day to day. If you were a Victorian parent, you probably lost at least one child, possibly several. Infant and child death was just part of life. Diseases ripped through communities. Scarlet fever epidemics would sweep through a neighborhood, killing children in house after house. Diphtheria caused slow suffocation. Whooping cough could last for months, the child coughing until they vomited, struggling to breathe. Measles, which we now vaccinate against, killed thousands of children every year. Tuberculosis was everywhere, slowly wasting away its victims over months or years. And there was basically nothing doctors could do. They'd try various treatments, bloodletting, which definitely didn't help, mercury-based medicines, which were toxic, opium for pain and coughs, which at least provided some relief, but also addicted children. Home remedies were often just as useless or dangerous, poultices made of bizarre ingredients, herbal concoctions, prayer. Parents watched their children suffer and die, unable to save them. Can you imagine? Actually, probably better not to. Too depressing. Queen Victoria herself lost several grandchildren to illness. Her daughter Alice lost a daughter to diphtheria. Then Alice herself died of diphtheria while nursing her sick children. Victoria's son Leopold had hemophilia. This was before they understood it was a genetic condition passed through Victoria's line. Leopold suffered his whole life, constantly bruising and bleeding internally. He died at 30 after a fall. Even royalty, with access to the best medical care available, couldn't protect their children from disease and genetic conditions. For poor children, health was even more precarious. Malnutrition was rampant. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, left children with bent bones and stunted growth.
You could identify poor Victorian children by their bowed legs, scurvy from lack of vitamin C, anemia, constant infections. Living conditions in slums were horrific. Overcrowding meant diseases spread rapidly. Lack of clean water, open sewers, contaminated food. Children's bodies were already weakened by poor nutrition and overwork. They had no resistance when illness struck.
Industrial diseases affected child workers. Respiratory diseases from inhaling cotton dust or coal dust. Bone deformities from repetitive motions or carrying heavy loads. Eye strain from working in poor light. Match girls who worked in match factories developed phossy jaw from exposure to white phosphorus. Their jawbones literally rotted away. It was agonizing and disfiguring. Child chimney sweeps developed scrotal cancer from constant contact with soot, usually fatal and absolutely horrific. And mental health. Victorians didn't really have a framework for understanding children's mental health. Depression, anxiety, trauma, these weren't recognized as legitimate conditions in children. If a child was melancholic or nervous, they might be told to snap out of it, or given some useless tonic, or punished for being difficult. Children who witnessed traumatic things, experienced abuse, or suffered from what we'd now recognize as mental illness had nowhere to turn and no treatment.
Some ended up in asylums. Victorian asylums for children were nightmarish, overcrowded, brutal. Children were restrained, isolated, or subjected to various treatments that didn't help. So Victorian children dealt with physical illness, untreated mental health issues, and a medical establishment that was mostly ineffective. Fun times. Now let's talk about play, or rather the lack of it. Victorian attitudes toward play were complicated. For upper-class children, too much play was considered frivolous and potentially corrupting. For working children, there simply wasn't time. When upper-class children did play, it was often structured and educational. Toys had moral purposes. Building blocks taught spatial reasoning and patience. Dolls taught girls how to be mothers. Toy soldiers taught boys about military glory and empire. There were books and books of improving games for children, educational card games about geography or history, puzzles that taught moral lessons. Every plaything had to have a purpose beyond mere enjoyment.
Outdoor play was encouraged for health reasons, fresh air and exercise, but it was supposed to be controlled. Organized games, structured activities, not wild running about. And always, always you had to stay clean and proper. Can't mess up those expensive clothes. Can't get dirty and look common. Girls especially were restricted. Vigorous play wasn't ladylike. You might damage your health, or worse, your reputation. Gentle walks were fine. Mild games were acceptable. Anything energetic or competitive, unbecoming. Boys had more freedom, but even their play was supposed to develop manly virtues. Sports were about building character, learning teamwork, and preparing for future military or leadership roles, not about having fun. Working-class children played in the streets when they could.
street games, singing games, hopscotch, marbles. These cost nothing and required no equipment. But their time was limited. Work came first, and city streets were dangerous. Traffic, criminals, older children who might bully or exploit them.
Some philanthropic organizations started creating playgrounds and providing structured recreation for poor children. But this was late Victorian era, and it was about moral improvement as much as fun, teaching poor children proper behavior and keeping them out of trouble. Toys for wealthy children were elaborate and expensive. Rocking horses, dolls' houses, mechanical toys. Beautiful, but often fragile and not really meant for rough play. Poor children had homemade toys, rag dolls, wooden spinning tops, whatever could be cobbled together from scraps. Or they played with things that weren't toys at all, sticks, stones, whatever they found. But in both cases, Victorian childhood involved less play than we'd consider normal now. Children were expected to be useful, productive, and serious. Play was tolerated, but not prioritized. Let's drift into the whole moral instruction thing, because Victorians were obsessed with it.
Victorian society was deeply religious, or at least publicly religious. Christian morality was supposed to guide every aspect of life, and children needed to be thoroughly instructed in it. Sunday was entirely devoted to religion. Church in the morning, Sunday school in the afternoon, evening services. No play, no fun, just worship and moral instruction. During the week, children learned their catechism, memorized Bible verses, studied religious texts, prayer before meals, before bed, throughout the day. The morality taught was very focused on obedience, duty, and self-control. Honor your parents, respect your betters, control your sinful impulses, work hard, don't complain. Children were taught they were born sinful. This was a core belief. You came into the world tainted by original sin. Only through constant vigilance and moral instruction could you hope to become good.
This is a heavy burden to place on a child. You're inherently bad. Your natural impulses are wrong. You must constantly fight against your own nature. Victorian children's literature is full of this stuff. Moral tales where naughty children die horribly as punishment for their sins. Good children who suffer nobly and are rewarded in heaven. There was a whole genre of Sunday school prize books, stories given as rewards for good behavior or memorizing Bible verses. They were relentlessly didactic. Every story had a clear moral lesson. The history of the Fairchild family is a perfect example. It was incredibly popular. In one famous scene, the father takes his children to see a corpse hanging from a gibbet to teach them about the consequences of sin. The corpse is of a man who killed his brother. The children are expected to look at this rotting body and learn that quarreling with siblings could lead to murder, because that's totally a proportionate response and not at all traumatic.
But this was considered good parenting. Teach children about sin and death. Make sure they understand the stakes. Other popular books included The Pilgrim's Progress, which children were expected to read and understand. Cautionary tales, which were funny in a dark way, but also genuinely taught that misbehavior led to gruesome deaths. Even Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, which seems whimsical to us, was partly a reaction against this heavy-handed moralizing. Carol wanted to write something purely for children's enjoyment, without constant lessons. It was almost revolutionary. Religious instruction wasn't just for upper-class children either. Sunday schools for working-class children were hugely popular. They taught basic literacy using the Bible. They provided moral guidance. They emphasized obedience and acceptance of one's social position. The message was clear. Your life might be hard now, but if you're good and obedient and accept God's will, you'll be rewarded in heaven. Don't question, don't rebel, just endure. Convenient for maintaining social order, wasn't it?
And charity schools run by religious organizations definitely emphasized moral instruction along with basic education. You were being saved from poverty and sin simultaneously. You should be grateful and obedient. For children in orphanages or workhouses, religious instruction was constant. Hours of prayer and Bible study. It was supposed to uplift them. Mostly, it just made already difficult lives even more restrictive. So, Victorian children grew up absolutely saturated in religious moral teaching. Everything was about duty, obedience, controlling sinful impulses, and preparing for death or a morally upright adult life. Not exactly light-hearted. Let's look at some more specific examples of Victorian children who had particularly intense experiences. Winston Churchill, born 1874, toward the end of the Victorian era, his childhood was lonely and emotionally cold. His parents were aristocratic and largely uninterested in him. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was focused on his political career. His mother, Jenny, was a famous beauty who preferred socializing to mothering. Winston was raised by a nanny, Mrs. Everest, who was the only person who showed him real affection. He adored her. He was sent to boarding school at age 7. He hated it. He was bullied. He struggled academically in the rigid classical curriculum. He was beaten regularly for poor performance or misbehavior. Later, he was sent to Harrow, where things improved slightly, but he still felt isolated and desperate for his parents' approval. His father was cold and critical. His mother was distant. Winston wrote her constant letters begging her to visit. She rarely came. When Mrs. Everest was dismissed from service and became ill, Winston's parents didn't help her. Winston, still basically a child himself, visited her and paid for her care from his limited allowance. She died when he was 20, and he was devastated. She'd been the only person who truly loved him during his childhood. Churchill's childhood left him with deep insecurities and a desperate need for achievement and recognition. His later greatness was built partly on childhood wounds. Or consider Florence Nightingale, born 1820. Her childhood was privileged but restrictive. She was educated well for a girl, learning languages, mathematics, and history. Her father was unusually progressive about educating his daughters. But her mother and sister expected her to conform to typical upper-class female life: social calls, embroidery, eventually marriage. Florence felt called to nursing, but this was absolutely not acceptable for a woman of her class. Nursing was associated with prostitution and drunkenness. Respectable women didn't do it.
She struggled for years, feeling trapped and purposeless. Her family blocked her ambitions. She became depressed and ill. She didn't escape to pursue nursing until her 30s. Her childhood and young adulthood were spent fighting against the restrictions placed on her gender and class. If she'd been born into a different family or era, would she have been able to pursue her calling earlier? Would she have achieved even more? We'll never know. The Victorian system limited her, even as it provided her with education and resources. Let's think about orphans for a moment, because Victorian orphans had it particularly rough. If your parents died and you had no family to take you in, you had limited options: orphanages, the workhouse, the street. Orphanages varied wildly in quality. Some were reasonably well run by charitable organizations. Others were overcrowded, underfunded nightmares. Dr. Barnardo's homes were famous for taking in destitute children. Thomas Barnardo started his work in the 1860s, rescuing children from the streets of London. At its peak, his organization cared for thousands of children. The conditions were institutional, strict, regimented, but at least the children were fed and clothed and given basic education. Other orphanages were worse: minimal food, harsh punishments, child labor disguised as training. The workhouse was dreaded. Poor families ended up there when they had no other option. Children and parents were separated. The conditions were deliberately made unpleasant to discourage people from seeking help. Children in workhouses wore uniforms, ate gruel and bread, worked at tedious tasks like picking oakum, which involved unraveling old rope until your fingers bled. Education was minimal. The goal was to make children into useful laborers, nothing more.
Charles Dickens famously depicted workhouse childhood in Oliver Twist. Oliver asking for more food, the cruelty of Mr. Bumble, the exploitation. Dickens knew what he was writing about. His own childhood included a stint in a workhouse when his father was imprisoned for debt. Dickens was sent to work in a blacking factory at age 12. The shame and trauma of that experience stayed with him forever. He was only there for a few months, but it shaped his entire worldview. His novels are full of mistreated children because he'd been one. Street children, orphaned or abandoned, lived by their wits, begging, stealing, selling what they could. Victorian London was full of street children. Estimates vary, but thousands of children lived rough. They slept in doorways, under bridges, in abandoned buildings. They formed gangs for protection. Older children looked after younger ones or exploited them. The criminal underworld used child labor too. Fagin, in Oliver Twist, training children as pickpockets, wasn't pure fiction. That happened. Small children could slip through crowds, and nimble fingers could lift wallets and handkerchiefs. If caught, the child took the punishment, while the adult organizer stayed free. Child prostitution was also rampant. Girls and boys sold on the streets. The age of consent was 12 for most of the Victorian era. 12. Campaigners fought to raise it.
W.T. Stead, a journalist, famously wrote The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon in 1885, exposing child prostitution. He actually bought a 13-year-old girl to prove how easy it was. The scandal helped raise the age of consent to 16, but it didn't eliminate the problem. Victorian childhood, especially for the poor and vulnerable, could be absolutely brutal.
Even within families, children were often exploited. Large families meant older children raised younger ones. Girls especially were expected to care for siblings, do housework, and contribute to the family economy. Their own childhoods were sacrificed for family survival. In rural areas, children worked on farms from young ages, planting, harvesting, tending animals. It was hard physical labor in all weather. Agricultural work was slightly less dangerous than industrial work, but still, long hours, physical exhaustion, little education. And rural poverty was grinding. Families lived in tiny cottages. Food was scarce in bad years. Medical care was almost non-existent in remote areas. Victorian childhood varied enormously based on class and location, but in almost every case it involved less protection, less play, and more adult responsibility than we'd consider appropriate now. Let's talk about some of the reformers who tried to change things, because there were people fighting for better treatment of children. Lord Shaftesbury was a major figure in child welfare reform. He was an evangelical Christian who believed passionately that society had a duty to protect vulnerable people, especially children. He championed the Factory Acts that gradually restricted child labor. The 1833 Factory Act banned children under 9 from working in textile mills and limited older children's hours. Later acts expanded protections to other industries. It was slow progress, and enforcement was inconsistent, but it was something. Shaftesbury also worked on behalf of chimney sweeps, agricultural workers, and children in mines. The 1842 Mines Act banned women and children under 10 from working underground. Can you imagine that being considered progressive? No children under 10 in coal mines. What a reform.
But compared to what came before, it was significant. Shaftesbury spent decades fighting for these incremental improvements. Other reformers focused on education. The Ragged School movement provided free education to destitute children. The schools were basic, but they gave children who otherwise would have had nothing at least some learning. Reformers like Mary Carpenter opened industrial schools and reformatories for young offenders. The idea was rehabilitation rather than pure punishment. Victorian prisons held children alongside adult criminals. Children as young as 8 or 9 could be imprisoned. The conditions were horrific. Reformatories separated children and focused on education and training. They were still institutional and strict, but better than adult prisons. Social reformers like Charles Booth and Seabohm Rowntree conducted studies documenting poverty and its effects on families and children. Their work provided evidence that helped drive policy changes.
And medical advances gradually improved child survival.
understanding of germ theory, improved sanitation, eventually vaccines. By the end of the Victorian era in 1901, childhood was slowly starting to look more like what we'd recognize: compulsory education, restrictions on child labor, growing recognition that children needed protection and nurturing. But for most of Victoria's 63-year reign, childhood was harsh. Children were expected to grow up fast because society demanded it. We've drifted through education, health, play, moral instruction, specific examples, orphans, and reformers. The picture is pretty clear. Victorian children didn't have childhoods in the modern sense. They had preparation for adult roles, whether that meant learning to run a household, memorizing Latin declensions, working in a factory, or simply surviving. The emotional cost was high. The physical cost was high. But Victorian society valued other things more than childhood well-being: productivity, respectability, obedience, empire.
Children were resources to be shaped and used, not people to be cherished and protected. Of course, there were exceptions: loving parents who tried to give their children happiness within the constraints of their society, reformers fighting for change, progressive thinkers advocating for better treatment. But the dominant culture was one that forced children to grow up too fast. Let's keep drifting through this topic. There's more to explore about the weird, specific ways Victorians approached childhood. So let's drift into some of the really specific, weird Victorian practices around child rearing. Because once you start digging into the details, it gets even stranger. Take feeding practices, for instance. What Victorian children ate and how they were expected to eat it reveals a lot about the attitudes toward childhood. For wealthy children, meals were regimented and purposefully bland. The Victorians believed that rich or flavorful food would overstimulate children and make them develop bad character. So children ate in the nursery, separate from adults, and their food was deliberately boring. Porridge, milk, bread and butter, boiled vegetables, plain meat if they were lucky. Nothing spiced, nothing interesting, just fuel. Sweets and treats were rare and given as rewards for good behavior. Too much sugar would spoil a child, make them demanding and weak-willed. Can't have that. Children were expected to eat everything on their plates without complaint. Pickiness wasn't tolerated. If you didn't like something, too bad, eat it anyway. Waste was sinful, and complaining was rude. Meal times had strict etiquette even for young children. Sit up straight. Use your utensils properly. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't make noise while eating. Don't ask for seconds. Basically, turn eating into another opportunity for discipline and control. Babies were a whole other situation. Breastfeeding was common across all classes, but wealthy Victorian women increasingly used wet nurses instead. Having another woman nurse your baby was a status symbol. It meant you could afford it. It also meant you didn't have to deal with the messiness of infant care. The baby stayed in the nursery with the nurse. You maintained your figure and your social life.
Some doctors warned that wet nurses could transfer moral qualities through their milk. If you hired a nurse with bad character, your baby might absorb her wickedness along with her milk. This was considered legitimate medical concern. So you had to carefully vet wet nurses, make sure they were healthy, morally upright, and properly deferential. When babies were weaned, they were often given pap or panada, bread soaked in water or milk, sometimes sweetened. Not exactly nutritious, but it was soft enough for toothless mouths. Wealthier babies might get more elaborate foods, arrowroot biscuits, specially prepared broths, but still everything bland and simple. Working-class babies had it rougher. If the mother worked, and most did, the baby might be given opium-based soothing syrups to keep them quiet. Godfrey's Cordial and Dalby's Carminative were popular brands. These contained laudanum, which is basically opium mixed with alcohol. It did keep babies quiet. It also addicted them and sometimes killed them. But for a desperate mother who needed to work and couldn't have a crying baby disrupting things, it seemed like the only option. Child mortality from opiate overdoses was significant, but the practice continued because the alternatives seemed worse.
Feeding bottles existed, but they were dangerous. They were hard to clean, and bacteria grew in the tubes and crevices. Bottle-fed babies had much higher mortality rates than breastfed babies. Condensed milk became available later in the Victorian era and was marketed as scientific and modern. But it was expensive, and many mothers diluted it too much, leaving babies malnourished. For working-class children, the diet was repetitive and often inadequate. Bread, potatoes, maybe some dripping or margarine, tea, heavily sugared and milked, even for young children. Meat was a luxury. Fresh vegetables were expensive. Fruit was rare. This led to all those deficiency diseases we mentioned earlier: rickets, scurvy, anemia. Children's bodies couldn't develop properly without adequate nutrition. And hungry children tried to fill their stomachs with whatever they could. Street children ate scraps, stole food when they could, begged for handouts. Some survived on nothing but bread and tea for days at a time. In workhouses, the food was famously terrible. Gruel, which was watery oatmeal, bread, occasionally some cheese or meat, but not often. It was calculated to be just enough to sustain life and nothing more. Making the workhouse unpleasant was policy. Can't make poverty too comfortable, or people might choose it. Even in orphanages and charity schools, food was minimal. The children were always hungry. Growth was stunted. Energy was low. And meal times were silent. Children ate in rows, quickly and quietly, then back to work or lessons. Food as joy, as comfort, as a social experience, not for Victorian children. Food was fuel at best, another site of control and deprivation at worst.
Let's float over to the topic of fresh air and exercise, because Victorian attitudes here were contradictory in interesting ways. On one hand, fresh air was considered essential for health. Children needed to spend time outdoors to develop properly. The Victorians got this right, actually. But on the other hand, exercise was supposed to be controlled and purposeful, especially for girls. Boys were encouraged to participate in sports, cricket, rugby, rowing. This built physical strength and taught teamwork and competition. Healthy body, healthy mind, strong character. Boarding schools made sports a central part of the curriculum. Hours every day spent on athletic fields. This was considered as important as academic learning. The playing fields of Eton supposedly won the Battle of Waterloo, according to the Duke of Wellington. British boys learned courage and discipline through sport, which made them superior soldiers and leaders. Or so the theory went.
But girls, oh, girls had to be so careful. Too much exercise could damage their delicate reproductive systems. Remember, the Victorians believed women had limited energy that had to be carefully rationed between brain, body, and womb. So girls could take gentle walks, play croquet, which was suitably sedate, maybe some light calisthenics, but running, competing, breaking a sweat? Absolutely not. Unladylike and medically dangerous. This meant girls grew up physically weaker. Corsets restricted their breathing and movement. Lack of exercise meant poor muscle development. Heavy skirts impeded their legs. And then doctors would point to women's physical weakness as evidence that they were naturally inferior to men. Circular logic at its finest. Some progressive reformers advocated for rational dress and more exercise for girls. The Bloomer movement tried to popularize pants for women. It was mocked and largely failed, but the effort was there.
By the late Victorian era, some girls' schools were introducing more physical education. Tennis became acceptable for women. Bicycling became popular, though initially scandalous. But for most of the Victorian period, girls were kept physically restricted, while boys were encouraged to be active. Both genders, though, were expected to maintain perfect posture. Sit up straight, stand tall, don't slouch. There were devices to enforce this. Backboards that girls were strapped to for hours to improve their posture, neck braces, shoulder restraints. Deportment was taught explicitly: how to walk gracefully, how to sit properly, how to move through a room with dignity. Children practiced with books balanced on their heads. They were corrected constantly: shoulders back, chin up, stomach in. The Victorian ideal body was controlled, restrained, nothing loose or casual or relaxed. So even when children were allowed to play or exercise, their bodies were still regulated and monitored. Now, let's talk about birthdays and holidays, because these were treated very differently than today. Birthdays were acknowledged, but not celebrated with the kind of enthusiasm we have now. There might be a small gift, perhaps a special meal, but not elaborate parties or excessive presents. Too much fuss over a child's birthday would make them conceited and spoil them. Better to keep it low-key. Christmas was becoming more elaborate during the Victorian era. Prince Albert popularized the Christmas tree tradition in Britain. Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol helped establish Christmas as a family-centered holiday. But even Christmas had a moral and religious core. It was about charity, family duty, and Christian devotion, not just presents and fun. Children might get some gifts: an orange, which was an exotic luxury, a new book, a small toy, maybe some sweets. Wealthy children got more elaborate presents, but even then the focus was on gratitude and proper behavior. You wrote thank you notes.
You demonstrated appropriate appreciation. Christmas Day included church services, family meals, and maybe some parlor games, but it was still fairly controlled and proper. Easter was primarily religious, church services, maybe some special food, not commercialized like today. Other holidays varied by region and class. May Day celebrations, harvest festivals, religious feast days. Working-class children might enjoy street fairs and festivals. These were rare opportunities for genuine fun and freedom. But overall, Victorian childhood didn't include a lot of celebration or frivolity. Life was serious business. Even toys, which we touched on earlier, deserve more attention, because Victorian toys are fascinating in their mix of beauty and weirdness. Wealthy children had access to elaborate toys, dolls with porcelain faces and fancy clothes, doll houses with tiny furniture and detailed decorations, rocking horses, mechanical toys that moved or made sounds. But many of these toys were fragile and expensive. Children were expected to play carefully with them. Don't break things. Don't make a mess. Some toys were explicitly educational. Alphabet blocks, puzzle maps teaching geography, building sets teaching engineering principles. Even toy soldiers, which seemed purely for play, were meant to teach boys about military glory and British imperial power. You reenacted famous battles. You learned strategy. Dolls taught girls maternal skills. You dressed your doll, cared for it, practiced the nurturing you'd need for future children.
Some Victorian dolls are genuinely creepy. Wax dolls that looked disturbingly realistic. Dolls with glass eyes that seemed to stare. Dolls dressed in elaborate mourning clothes. Yes, mourning dolls were a thing. In a society obsessed with death, children had dolls dressed in black to teach them about grief. Not disturbing at all. Board games existed and were popular, but again, many had educational or moral purposes. Games teaching Bible stories, games about the rewards of hard work and the dangers of vice. The Mansion of Happiness was an early board game where players advanced by demonstrating virtues and were set back by vices. Land on Sabbath breaking and you had to go back. Reach the Mansion of Happiness through good behavior. Fun, but with a heavy dose of moral instruction. For poorer children, toys were simpler. Homemade rag dolls, carved wooden toys, balls made from rags or scrap material. Or they played with found objects. Sticks became swords, stones became game pieces. Imagination filled in the rest. Street games required no equipment. Hopscotch drawn in chalk, skipping rope games, tag and chasing games, singing games with rhymes passed down through generations. These were free and accessible, but again, working children had limited time for play. Let's drift into the realm of Victorian children's literature beyond just the moral tales, because some of the books from this era are still famous today. Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland came out in 1865. It was revolutionary because it was pure nonsense and imagination. No heavy-handed moral lessons, just a strange, wonderful adventure. Victorian children and adults loved it. It became hugely popular.
Carroll followed it with Through the Looking Glass. These books respected children's imagination and intelligence. They didn't talk down to readers or constantly moralize. That was unusual for the time.
Robert Louis Stevenson wrote Treasure Island and Kidnapped. Adventure stories with excitement and danger. Boys especially loved these. Rudyard Kipling wrote The Jungle Book and later the Just So stories. These had some moral elements but were primarily entertaining. Louisa May Alcott's Little Women was published in America but widely read in Britain. It showed girls with personalities and ambitions, though still within acceptable boundaries. Frances Hodgson Burnett wrote Little Lord Fauntleroy and later The Secret Garden. These were phenomenally popular. Little Lord Fauntleroy is interesting because it created a fashion trend. The main character wore velvet suits with lace collars. Suddenly, wealthy parents were dressing their sons in these elaborate outfits. The boys hated it. They looked ridiculous and were teased, but mothers thought it was adorable and fashionable.
This lasted for years. Generations of Victorian and Edwardian boys were traumatized by Fauntleroy suits, all because of one popular book. The Secret Garden is gentler. It's about children healing through nature and friendship. It's still read today. Then there were school stories. Tom Brown's School Days we mentioned. It romanticized the boarding school experience, despite depicting bullying and harshness. Countless other school stories followed. They were hugely popular, especially with boys. They reinforced the idea that boarding school suffering built character. Girls had their own school stories, though fewer. Angela Brazel started writing girls' school stories in the late Victorian and Edwardian period. Fairy tales were collected and published. The Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, these were often darker than we remember them now. Children died. Villains were punished brutally. But Victorians thought children should learn that the world was harsh.
Andrew Lang published his colored fairy tale books, the Blue Fairy Book, the Red Fairy Book, and so on. Collections of folk tales from around the world. These were popular in nurseries and schoolrooms. Children loved them, even when they were frightening. And there were magazines for children. The Boys' Own Paper started in 1879, full of adventure stories, sports, and moral guidance for boys. The Girls' Own Paper followed, with stories, needlework patterns, cooking advice, and guidance on being proper young ladies. So Victorian children did have access to literature, more than previous generations. The growth of literacy and cheaper printing meant books became more available. But even the fun stories carried cultural messages. Boys should be brave and adventurous. Girls should be gentle and domestic. British children should be proud of their empire. Hard work and virtue would be rewarded. Entertainment always came with instruction.
Let's talk about photography, because the Victorian era saw the rise of photography, and children were frequent subjects. Early Victorian photographs required long exposure times. Subjects had to sit completely still for seconds or even minutes. This is why Victorian photographs look so stiff and serious. You couldn't smile and hold it for that long. you had to maintain a neutral expression. Children especially struggled with this. Getting a small child to sit perfectly still was nearly impossible. So you have these photographs of Victorian children looking extremely solemn, tiny faces with serious expressions. They look like miniature adults because they're dressed like miniature adults and forced to pose like adults. Some photographs used restraints to keep children still. Hidden behind their clothes or furniture, there would be metal stands or clamps helping them maintain position. Creepy? Absolutely, but necessary given the technology.
Post-mortem photography was also common. When a child died, the family might have a photograph taken, sometimes the only photograph they'd ever have of that child. The child would be posed as if sleeping, or sometimes positioned with living family members. These memento mori were treasured keepsakes. To modernize, they're disturbing, but in a time of high child mortality and limited photography, they made sense to grieving families. As photography technology improved and exposure times shortened, photos became more natural. But the early Victorian photographs are striking in how serious and adult the children appear. Let's float back to royal children for more examples, because there are so many. The Romanov children of Russia, though not British royalty, were related to British royalty and had similar upbringings in many ways.
Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra had 4 daughters and 1 son. They were raised in relative isolation, very protected and very controlled. Alexandra was actually Queen Victoria's granddaughter, and she brought some of those strict Victorian attitudes to Russian parenting. The children were dressed simply compared to some royals, but they had rigid schedules, tutors, and high expectations. Their brother Alexei had hemophilia, inherited through Victoria's line. He suffered terribly with bleeding episodes. His mother was desperate to protect him, which led to the influence of Rasputin, which contributed to the fall of the dynasty. Again, Victorian genetic legacy causing problems. The children seemed to have genuine affection within their family, which was nice, but they were trapped by their roles and the political situation.
They all died together in 1918, executed during the Russian Revolution. They were so young. The youngest, Anastasia, was 17. Alexei was only 13. Their childhood was privileged but ultimately tragic, raised for roles they'd never fulfill in a world that was changing too fast. Or look at the various European minor royals. Every little principality and duchy had royal children being raised with enormous pressure and limited freedom. They were pawns in diplomatic marriages. Their childhoods were preparation for political alliances. Young princesses learned languages and accomplishments so they'd be attractive marriage prospects. Young princes learned military skills and statecraft. Personal happiness or choice? Not really a consideration. Many of these children grew up and made marriages they didn't want, had lives they didn't choose, produced more royal children for the same system.
The European royal families were all interrelated by the late Victorian era. Queen Victoria was called the grandmother of Europe
because her children and grandchildren married into most European royal houses. This meant hemophilia spread through European royalty like wildfire. Victoria was a carrier. Her daughters and granddaughters were carriers or had hemophiliac sons. The disease affected Russian, Spanish, and German royalty. Children suffered and died because of genetic disorders concentrated by generations of inbreeding. And no one really understood why until much later. They knew it ran in families. They knew it affected boys, but the genetic mechanism wasn't understood. So royal children continued to be born with this terrible condition, and their parents could only watch them suffer. Beyond hemophilia, the general inbreeding led to all sorts of problems: physical weakness, mental instability, shortened lifespans. But royalty kept marrying royalty because that's what you did. Maintaining bloodline purity was more important than genetic health. The results were predictable and sad. Let's talk about coming of age, because the transition from child to adult in Victorian society had specific markers. For boys, going to university or entering a profession marked adulthood, or joining the military. At 18 or 21, you were expected to start taking on adult responsibilities. If you were upper class, you might do a grand tour of Europe. This was educational travel, exposing you to art, culture, and classical sites. It was a rite of passage for wealthy young men. Then you returned, ready to take your place in adult society. For working-class boys, adulthood came earlier, whenever you started doing a man's work for a man's wages. 14, 15, 16. You might even get married by 18 or 19. For girls, the marker was the debut season, when you came out into society.
At 17 or 18, upper-class girls were formally introduced to society. They attended balls and parties. The goal was to find a husband. This was the culmination of all that childhood training. Now you demonstrated your accomplishments, your ability to make conversation, your grace and beauty. The marriage market was exactly that, a market. Girls were evaluated on their looks, accomplishments, and dowries. Young men evaluated them and made offers. Romantic love was nice if it happened, but it wasn't required. A suitable match meant similar social class, adequate finances, and family approval. Girls who didn't marry quickly became anxious. Each year without a proposal reduced your value. By your mid-20s, you were worryingly old. Past 30 and unmarried, you were a spinster. The pressure was intense. Your entire childhood prepared you for this. If you failed to marry, what had it all been for?
Some girls did choose not to marry, or circumstances prevented it, but they lived restricted lives under their father's authority, then perhaps a brother's. Limited independence. For working-class girls, marriage also came early, late teens or early 20s. You married someone from your own class, a tradesman, a laborer, someone you met locally. Or you didn't marry and continued working as a servant, a factory worker, a shop girl, whatever was available.
Either way, childhood ended abruptly when adult responsibilities began. There was no prolonged adolescence like we have now, no gap between childhood and adult life. You transitioned quickly and were expected to cope. Victorian teenagers don't really exist as a concept. You were either a child under your parents' control or an adult with adult obligations. The in-between period was brief. This meant young people took on massive responsibilities early. Marriage, children, careers, financial independence. And they often struggled, emotionally, practically. But struggling wasn't an excuse. You were an adult now. Figure it out. The concept of the teenager as a distinct life stage didn't emerge until the 20th century. The Victorians would have found it baffling. Why would you prolong the period of irresponsibility? Get children into useful adult roles as quickly as possible. That's how society functions. Let's drift into some darker territory. Child abuse and neglect in Victorian times. We've talked about harsh discipline being normal, beatings, emotional manipulation, shaming. This was standard parenting. But beyond normal Victorian harshness, there was genuine abuse and very little protection for children.
If your parents beat you severely, starved you, locked you in cupboards, no one intervened. What happened in the home was private. Parents had almost absolute authority over their children. There were horrific cases that occasionally came to public attention. Children beaten to death. Children kept in cages. Children deliberately starved. When these cases went to court, punishments for parents were often light. It was considered a domestic matter. The parent had a right to discipline their child. Only the most extreme cases resulted in serious consequences. Sexual abuse happened, though it was rarely discussed. Children were vulnerable to adults in positions of power. Employers, teachers, family members, and they had no recourse. Who would believe them? Who would help? The whole system protected adult authority over children's safety.
Some reformers tried to address this. The Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children was founded in the 1880s. They investigated cases and tried to remove children from dangerous situations. But they were limited in what they could do. Parental rights were strong. Proof was hard to gather. Society was reluctant to intervene. So, countless children suffered abuse with no escape. In institutions like orphanages, workhouses, and boarding schools, abuse was even easier. No parents to complain, no oversight, just vulnerable children and adults with unchecked power. Some institutions were well run by dedicated people trying to help children. Others were nightmares of systematic abuse. And children couldn't escape. They had no rights, no voice, no power.
This was true across all classes. Wealthy children abused by parents or servants. Poor children exploited by employers. Orphans victimized by those supposed to care for them. Victorian society's failure to protect children is one of its darkest aspects. Let's lighten things slightly and talk about pets,
because Victorian children did sometimes have animal companions. Upper-class children might have ponies, dogs, cats, small animals like rabbits or birds. These pets taught responsibility. You learned to care for another creature, to be gentle and patient. Queen Victoria's children had various pets, ponies especially. They learned to ride young. Horseback riding was an essential skill for their class. Pets provided companionship, which was valuable for lonely children raised by servants rather than parents.
For working-class children, pets were less common. Animals cost money to feed. But some families kept cats for pest control or dogs for protection. And street children sometimes befriended stray animals. A dog might provide warmth on cold nights and protection from threats. The Victorian era saw the rise of organized animal welfare movements. The RSPCA was founded early in the century. There was growing sense that cruelty to animals was wrong. Interestingly, sometimes animals received more legal protection than children. The RSPCA existed before the NSCCP. Society organized to prevent cruelty to animals before organizing to prevent cruelty to children. Because animals were innocent and helpless, but children, well, children needed discipline. The logic was twisted, but there it was. Still, the affection between Victorian children and their pets was real. In a world of emotional restraint, animals provided unconditional love. Now, let's float toward the end of the Victorian era and see how things started to change. By the 1880s and 1890s, attitudes toward childhood were gradually shifting. The reforms we mentioned earlier were having effects. Child labor was increasingly restricted. Education was more accessible. Infant mortality was starting to decline thanks to better sanitation and medical care. The idea of childhood as a special, protected time was gaining traction, not fully realized yet, but growing. Children's rights were being discussed. The concept that children deserved protection and care, not just discipline and control. Parenting advice was changing. Some writers advocated for more affection and less physical punishment, for understanding children's development rather than trying to force them into adult molds immediately.
But change was slow. Most Victorian children still grew up with the expectations and restrictions we've been discussing. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, an era ended. The Edwardian period that followed had its own issues, but it was slightly gentler toward children. The 20th century would bring even more changes. Child labor laws strengthened, universal education, child psychology as a field, recognition of childhood trauma. But Victorian children didn't benefit from these future changes. They lived in their own time, under their own rules. And those rules forced them to grow up too fast. Whether through labor, education, social expectations, or simple survival, Victorian children took on adult burdens long before they should have. Their childhoods were stolen by a society that valued productivity and propriety over innocence and play.
The legacy of Victorian childhood is complicated. Some of the discipline and educational rigor produced capable adults. Some of the expectations taught valuable skills. But the emotional cost was high. The physical cost was high. The loss of childhood as a joyful, protected time was real. We look back now with horror at child labor, with disbelief at the harshness, with sadness at the waste. But we can also trace the beginnings of modern childhood in Victorian reform movements. The activists and writers who said children deserved better. They planted seeds that grew into the protections we have now. So Victorian childhood was a time of contradiction, exploitation and emerging protection, harshness and sentimental idealization, rapid growing up and the invention of childhood as we know it.
The children themselves navigated this as best they could. Some thrived despite the obstacles. Some were broken by them. Most just survived and became adults carrying their childhood scars. And here we are, drifting through their stories, grateful we weren't born in 1850, falling asleep to tales of corsets and coal mines and impossible expectations. Let's keep floating through a few more aspects of this peculiar era. So, let's drift into some of the regional and international aspects of Victorian childhood, because it wasn't just England dealing with these attitudes. Scotland had its own particular flavor of strict childhood. Scottish Presbyterianism was, if anything, even more severe about sin and moral instruction than English Anglicanism. Scottish children learned the shorter catechism, memorized it completely. This was a series of questions and answers about religious doctrine, and it was heavy stuff for young minds. What is the chief end of man? To glorify God and enjoy Him forever. That's the first question. It gets more complex from there. Sunday in Scotland was intensely observed. No play, no laughter, no activities except church and religious study. The Scottish Sabbath was famously strict. Children who broke Sabbath rules faced serious punishment. This was considered a matter of their immortal souls. Scottish education was actually quite good, even for working-class children. Scotland had a longer tradition of parish schools that taught basic literacy, so Scottish children might be better educated than their English counterparts, but they were also under stricter religious control. In Ireland, childhood varied enormously by religion and class. Protestant Anglo-Irish children of the upper classes had experiences similar to English children: governesses, strict education, eventual boarding schools in England. Irish children, especially poor ones, had it much harder. Ireland faced periodic famines. The Great Famine of the 1940s killed or displaced millions. Children starved. Families were torn apart. Irish children emigrated in huge numbers, sent alone to America or Australia, sometimes as young as 10 or 12, sailing across the ocean to find work or join relatives. Can you imagine being a child, leaving your family forever, crossing the Atlantic alone? But it happened constantly. Irish children who stayed often worked in difficult conditions: agricultural labor, domestic service, whatever was available. And the political situation meant additional hardship, conflict, displacement, poverty deeper than most of England experienced. In Wales, language was an issue. Many Welsh children spoke Welsh at home, but were forced to speak English at school. They were punished for using their native language. The Welsh knot was a practice where children caught speaking Welsh had to wear a piece of wood on a string around their neck. At the end of the day, whoever wore it got beaten. This taught them English, but it also taught them shame about their own culture. Welsh children worked in coal mines, slate quarries, and farms. The work was hard and dangerous. The conditions were grim. But Wales also had strong traditions of community and music. Children learned hymns and participated in Eisteddfod, cultural festivals celebrating Welsh language and arts. So there was cultural richness alongside hardship. Across the British Empire, British attitudes toward childhood were exported. Colonial children, both white settlers and indigenous children, experienced Victorian child-rearing practices. White settler children in Australia, Canada, South Africa, and elsewhere were raised with British values: strict discipline, moral instruction, education in British traditions. But they also had more physical freedom in some ways, more space, less rigid class structure in some colonies. Childhood could be slightly less confined. Though for children sent to Australia as orphans or convicts, life was extremely hard. Child convicts existed, transported for minor crimes like stealing bread. These children worked as laborers, servants, or apprentices in harsh conditions, far from home, no family, no protection. Indigenous children in colonized areas faced cultural destruction. Missionary schools tried to civilize them, which meant destroying their languages, religions, and cultures. Children were separated from families, forbidden to practice their traditions, forced into British clothing and customs, beaten for speaking their native languages. This was considered charity and education, saving savage children by making them British. The trauma inflicted on indigenous children throughout the empire was catastrophic and multi-generational. In India, British families faced a dilemma. The climate was considered unhealthy for children, so British children born in India were often sent back to England at young ages. 4, 5, 6 years old, shipped across the ocean to live with relatives or in boarding schools, separated from their parents for years. Parents believed this was necessary for the children's health and proper education, but the emotional cost was devastating. Children lost their parents and their home simultaneously. They arrived in a cold, unfamiliar country, were placed with strangers or in institutions. Many never fully bonded with their parents again. The separation came at such a crucial developmental age. And the parents suffered too, but duty to empire and to raising proper British children outweighed keeping families together. Rudyard Kipling experienced this. He was born in India, then sent to England at age 5 to live with a foster family. The woman was cruel. He was miserable. He called the house of desolation. The experience traumatized him. It shows up in his writing, the pain of childhood separation and suffering. But this was considered normal, the sacrifice required for empire. Let's float back to England and talk about some of the long-term effects on Victorian children who survived to adulthood. Many carried deep psychological scars.
The emotional repression, the harsh discipline, the lack of affection, these things don't just disappear when you turn 18. Victorian adults often replicated the patterns with their own children. They'd been raised harshly, so they raised their children harshly. The cycle continued. Some rebelled. They consciously tried to parent differently, to be warmer, to allow more freedom. But going against your entire upbringing is hard, even when you know it was wrong. The stiff upper lip, the emotional restraint, became a defining characteristic of British culture. Generations of people who couldn't express feelings, couldn't ask for help, couldn't show vulnerability.
This had national consequences. A culture that valued stoicism over emotional honesty, that saw asking for help as weakness. World War I happened just after the Victorian era ended, and British officers, raised in that Victorian model of emotional suppression and duty, sent men into horrific conditions while maintaining composure. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was considered cowardice because showing trauma was weak. Real men endured. Those attitudes came directly from Victorian child-rearing. Boys trained from young ages to suppress emotion, to endure suffering, to never complain. The men who died in trenches had been Victorian children. The officers who commanded them had been Victorian children. The whole system was shaped by those childhoods. On a more individual level, Victorian children who grew up became adults with complicated relationships to their own childhoods.
Some looked back with nostalgia, remembering the good parts and forgetting the harsh ones. Memory is selective. Some became reformers, dedicating their lives to making childhood better for the next generation. Some just carried on, damaged but functional, never quite understanding why they struggled emotionally. The Victorian women's movement had roots in women who'd experienced the limitations of Victorian girlhood and refused to accept them for the next generation. Activists fighting for women's education, women's suffrage, women's rights. They'd been girls told they couldn't learn mathematics or have careers. They fought to change that. Similarly, labor reformers who'd been child workers themselves fought to end child labor. They knew the cost firsthand. The early 20th century saw enormous social changes, many driven by people reacting against their Victorian childhoods.
But change was gradual. You can't undo generations of cultural patterns quickly. British emotional reserve persisted well into the 20th century. Strict parenting remained common. Class division stayed rigid. Even now, you can trace cultural patterns back to Victorian roots. The British reputation for politeness and restraint, the class consciousness, the particular flavor of British humor. These developed during or were reinforced during the Victorian era. Let's talk about some of the small daily experiences that defined Victorian childhood, the things that seem minor but added up. The cold. Victorian houses, even wealthy ones, were cold. Heating was expensive and inefficient. Central heating didn't exist. Children woke up in freezing bedrooms, dressed in cold rooms.
The nursery might have a small fire, but it didn't heat much.
Baths were infrequent and often cold or lukewarm. Being cold was just part of life. For poor children, it was worse. Inadequate clothing, drafty housing or no housing at all, chilblains from constant exposure to cold. The discomfort was constant and accepted. Or the darkness. Before electric lighting, evenings were dark. Candles and oil lamps provided limited light. Children went to bed early, partly because there wasn't much you could do in the dark. Reading by candlelight was hard on the eyes. Winters meant long, dark evenings with little to do. The boredom. Children had fewer entertainment options. No television, no internet, limited books unless you were wealthy, no recorded music.
You made your own entertainment. Imaginary games, conversations, whatever you could create. This probably encouraged creativity and imagination, but it also meant long stretches of tedium. Especially for children confined to nurseries or working long shifts at repetitive tasks, the boredom must have been crushing. The smells. Victorian cities smelled terrible. Horse manure everywhere, coal smoke, industrial pollution, open sewers in poor areas. Children's noses weren't spared. You just lived with it. And personal hygiene was limited. Bathing was infrequent. Deodorant didn't exist. People smelled. Children playing in streets dealt with all of this. The noise. Cities were loud, but in different ways than now. Horse hooves on cobblestones, street vendors calling out, factory sounds, church bells.
But no car engines, no electronic sounds. A different soundscape entirely. The sights. Victorian streets were busy and chaotic. Vendors, beggars, animals, crowds. Children saw poverty constantly. People with deformities or diseases. Public suffering was visible. They also saw public punishment, criminals in stocks, though this became less common as the era progressed. Public hangings ended in the 1860s, but earlier Victorian children might have witnessed them. Death and suffering weren't hidden away. They were part of the visual landscape. For wealthy children, the sights were different, but still memorable. Grand houses, elaborate clothing, servants bustling about. The contrast between rich and poor was stark and visible. All these sensory experiences shaped how Victorian children experienced the world. Let's think about the emotional landscape of Victorian childhood. What did it feel like to be a child in that era? For many, probably quite lonely. Even in large families, emotional connection might be limited. Servants raised you, not your parents. Siblings were companions, but also competitors for limited parental attention and approval. You learned not to express needs, not to cry, not to demand comfort. So even surrounded by people, you might feel isolated. Fear was probably common. Fear of punishment, fear of disappointing adults, fear of illness and death, which were constant threats.
Anxieties about the future. Would you make a good marriage? Would you succeed in your career? Would you survive to adulthood? But also, children are resilient. They find joy in small things, a rare treat, a game with siblings, a kind word from a servant.
time outdoors. Victorian children weren't miserable every moment. They had moments of happiness, laughter, play. The capacity for joy persists even in difficult circumstances. And many Victorian children probably didn't realize their childhoods were hard. It was just normal. Everyone they knew lived similarly. Only later, as adults exposed to different ideas, might they look back and recognize the harshness. Or they never did. They raised their own children the same way and thought it was right. Perspective matters. What seems cruel to us was normal to them.
Though the children who suffered extreme abuse or exploitation probably knew something was wrong. The child sweeping chimneys or working 16-hour days knew they were suffering, even if they didn't have language for why it was unjust. Let's talk about a few more specific individuals to end our journey through Victorian childhood. Arthur Conan Doyle, born 1859, he was sent to a Jesuit boarding school at age 9. The discipline was harsh, the religious instruction intense. He later rejected Catholicism entirely, possibly partly due to his school experience. He became a doctor, then a writer. Sherlock Holmes made him famous. His childhood gave him education and opportunities, but it also left him with complicated feelings about authority and religion.
Or Beatrix Potter, born 1866. She had a lonely upper-class childhood, raised in the nursery with her brother, limited social interaction. She developed an intense love of nature and animals, drew constantly, created imaginary worlds. Her creativity flourished partly because of isolation. She had time and space to develop her imagination. But she also struggled with the restrictions placed on her as a woman. She wanted to be a scientist. She studied fungi and made detailed illustrations. But the scientific establishment wouldn't take a woman seriously. Her research was ignored. She eventually turned to writing and illustrating children's books. Peter Rabbit and her other characters came from her childhood observations of animals. Success came despite the limitations placed on her, not because of them.
Or consider H.G. Wells, born 1866 to a working-class family. His childhood was marked by poverty and insecurity. He was apprenticed to various trades as a teenager, hated it, kept running away. Eventually, he managed to get education and became a teacher, then a writer. His science fiction often explored social themes, class, inequality, the future of humanity. His childhood poverty and his struggle to escape it shaped his worldview and his writing. These individuals succeeded, but they're the exceptions. Most Victorian children didn't become famous. They lived ordinary lives, shaped by their childhoods in quieter ways. The factory worker who never escaped poverty, the housewife who raised children like she'd been raised, the clerk who worked his whole life in an office. Their stories are less documented, but just as real. Victorian childhoods shaped millions of ordinary lives that history doesn't remember individually. As we drift toward the end here, let's reflect on what we've covered.
Victorian children grew up too fast because their society demanded it. Whether through labor, education, social expectations, or survival necessity, childhood was shortened. The wealthy were trained to be miniature adults. The poor were forced into adult labor. Everyone faced harsh discipline and emotional restriction. The costs were real: damaged childhoods, trauma, lost potential. But the era also saw the beginning of change. Reformers fighting for children's rights, laws restricting exploitation, growing recognition that childhood should be protected. The Victorians were transitioning from old attitudes about children as small adults to newer ideas about childhood as a special developmental stage. They didn't complete that transition, but they started it. The children who suffered under Victorian systems grew up and worked to change those systems, slowly, imperfectly, but change happened. We're still living with some Victorian legacy: class consciousness, emotional reserve, certain parenting attitudes. But we've also moved far beyond Victorian childhood in many ways: universal education, child labor laws, recognition of children's developmental needs, child psychology, and trauma-informed care. We know now that children need play, need emotional warmth, need protection from exploitation. The Victorians were figuring that out, slowly and inconsistently.
Looking back at Victorian childhood from our comfortable modern position, it's easy to judge, to be horrified, to feel superior. But we should also recognize that people in the future will probably look back at us with similar horror about things we consider normal now. Every era has blind spots, things that seem fine at the time but later are recognized as harmful. The Victorians loved their children in many cases, but cultural attitudes limited how that love could be expressed. Parents genuinely believed harsh discipline was good for children, that emotional restraint built character, that early labor taught valuable skills. They were wrong about a lot of things, but they weren't necessarily cruel by intention. They were products of their time. Though, of course, some were intentionally cruel. Abusers exist in every era. But most Victorian parents were doing what they thought was right, within the framework they'd inherited. As we close out this long, gentle ramble through Victorian childhood, the main takeaway is simple. Victorian children grew up too fast because everything about their world pushed them toward adulthood prematurely. Work, education, social expectations, clothing, discipline, emotional norms, all of it rushed childhood along. And while some thrived despite this, many suffered, many were damaged, many had their potential limited by circumstances beyond their control. But they endured, they survived, they became the adults who shaped the early 20th century. Their experiences, both the harm and the resilience, shaped the world we inherited.
So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, maybe think about those Victorian children for a moment. The 5-year-old climbing into a dark chimney, the teenager laced into a corset learning piano, the street child selling matches in the cold, the privileged child desperate for parental affection that never came.
They're long gone now. Their struggles are over, but their stories remain. Stories of childhood stolen by the demands of an era that valued productivity over innocence, propriety over play, duty over joy. They grew up too fast because they had no choice. We've drifted through their world for a while now, seeing the harshness and the small moments of light, the cruelty and the eventual reform, the individual tragedies and the slow social progress. It's been a long journey through a complicated era. Victorian childhood in all its strange, sad, occasionally beautiful detail. And now, as we reach the end, you can let it all drift away. Let the images of cold nurseries and factory floors, of boarding schools and street games, of stern parents and rare kindness all fade into the background. The Victorian children are at rest now, their stories told, their struggles acknowledged. You can rest too, comfortable in your warm bed, in an era where childhood is protected in ways the Victorians couldn't imagine. Sleep well, dream of simpler things. Let the long, strange story of Victorian childhood fade into pleasant, forgettable dreams. This has been a journey through why Victorian children grew up too fast, through the weird, sad, fascinating world of 19th century childhood. Thank you for drifting through it with me. Now, sleep. Just sleep.
Everything's okay. The Victorian era is long over. Those children are gone. The harshness has passed. You're here. You're safe. You're warm. And you can finally drift off. Good night.